The morning Lachlan Steele noticed his lead analyst wearing a turtleneck in 92-degree heat went quiet. And in Lachlan Steele's world, quiet was always more dangerous than anything he could say out loud. By 11 o'clock that night, the man Portia Hearn had agreed to marry was accelerating down I-90 with everything he owned stuffed into the back of a rental car, and he would never set foot in Chicago again. Portia had worked at Steele Capital Group for 4 years. She was 29 years old, 5'4", and the kind of woman who could pull a discrepancy out of a 40-page financial model the same way other people spotted a typo, instantly, without effort, with a quiet certainty that made the senior partners look twice every time she opened her mouth in a meeting. She wore her dark hair pinned back at her nape, kept her desk ferociously organized, and had rebuilt the company's entire risk assessment framework from scratch in her second year, saving Lachlan's real estate division somewhere in the neighborhood of $11 million on a single acquisition deal. She was also, as of a Tuesday morning in late July, wearing a charcoal-ribbed turtleneck in the middle of a Chicago heatwave, with both sleeves pulled firmly to her wrists. The executive floor of the Steele Capitol building on Michigan Avenue ran on a different kind of clock than the rest of the city. The lower floors had the hum of regular business hours, the churn of analysts and associates and client relations. But by the time you reached the 14th floor, the energy compressed. Everyone moved with purpose. Noise was minimal. Lachlan preferred it that way. He noticed Portia the moment she stepped off the elevator at 7:58 a.m., 3 minutes before the standing strategy session he'd called for 9 of his core team leads. She carried her laptop bag on her right shoulder, a coffee in her left hand, and she was walking with a careful, measured step that was slightly too controlled, too deliberate, the kind of walk a person adopts when something hurts, and they're determined not to let it show. Lachlan Steele had built his empire by reading rooms, reading people, and reading the spaces between what was said and what was true. He sat at the head of the conference table that morning and watched Portia Hearn pull her laptop from her bag and set it on the table without once extending her left arm above shoulder height. He said nothing. The meeting ran for 2 hours. Portia presented the revised projections for the Wicker Park Hotel conversion. 23 slides, flawless, delivered with the kind of calm authority that silenced the 3 men who'd been skeptical about her timeline. She answered every pushback directly and without flinching. When the CFO challenged her depreciation model, she didn't hesitate. She pulled up the supporting data, walked him through it once, and moved on, professional, composed. But when one of the partners let a binder drop flat on the table, a sharp, cracking sound, Portia's entire body went rigid for a fraction of a second. Her jaw tightened. Her left hand came up and gripped the edge of her laptop. It lasted less than 2 seconds before she smoothed it over entirely and kept talking. Lachlan watched that happen and felt something cold settle behind his sternum. After the meeting, his team filtered out. The catering staff had set up a working lunch in the side room, a spread from the Italian place on the Riverwalk that Lachlan's assistant ordered every other Tuesday: pasta, roasted vegetables, bread, a simple salad. Everyone filled plates. Portia stood at the edge of the room, nursing the coffee she'd been carrying since she arrived and eating nothing. When one of the junior analysts handed her a plate, she smiled, accepted it, set it on the table, and spent the next 40 minutes talking shop while the food went untouched in front of her. That afternoon, Lachlan called his head of security. "Her name is Portia Hearn," he said, standing at the window with his back to the empty office. "She's been with us 4 years. I want to know what her life looks like outside this building, who she lives with, what the neighbors say, whether there have been any calls to the building or her address. You have until 5 o'clock. Renzo, who had worked for Lachlan for 7 years and understood his particular economy of words, simply said, "I'll call you." At 4:43 he did. Lachlan listened without interrupting. When Renzo finished, Lachlan thanked him, set the phone down on his desk, and sat very still for a moment. Outside, the lake was going copper in the late afternoon light. He picked the phone back up. "Tell Marco to keep the car ready." By 6:30, the floor had cleared. Lachlan asked Portia to stay back for a review of the Wicker Park projections, a reasonable request, one she accepted without question. She gathered her notes and followed him into his office, where the city lights were beginning to come on, cool and distant through the floor-to-ceiling glass. He didn't open the projections. He said, "When did you eat last?" Portia looked up. A careful expression moved across her face, the kind of expression that had been practiced. "I had breakfast. I wasn't hungry at lunch." "You haven't eaten in front of me once today. Yesterday either, when I passed the break room at noon." He said it without accusation. Just observation. "I asked catering to order from Mia Francesca tonight. The food will be here in 20 minutes. I'd like you to eat something before we start." The careful expression held for a moment. Then she looked down at her notepad and said, "I'm on a restricted diet for the wedding." She paused. "Lance wants me to get to a certain, he says I'll feel better, at a lower weight, by September." Lachlan was quiet for long enough that she looked up. "What does Lance do?" he said. "He's in commercial lending. We've been together for 3 years." She said it the way people recite facts that have been repeated often enough to stop feeling like facts, smoothly, by rote. The food arrived. Lachlan sent his assistant home, set the containers out on the small meeting table by the window, and pulled out a chair. He didn't say anything else about the diet. He didn't say anything else about Lance. He just sat down, opened the containers, and started filling a plate. He set it in front of her. Portia looked at the food, gnocchi with brown butter and sage, the sauce still steaming, a portion of roasted broccolini, 2 pieces of bread. It wasn't a small plate. "I probably shouldn't." "Portia," he said her name quietly, and something in the way he said it made her stop. "You are the most analytically rigorous person on my entire team. I have paid you accordingly for 4 years because your mind is worth every dollar. The only thing Lance's opinion is qualified to inform is his own lunch order." He held her gaze. "Eat." Something moved across her face that she didn't manage to catch in time. Her throat tightened visibly. She picked up the fork. She took one bite, then another. By the third, her eyes had closed briefly, just for a moment, the way people close their eyes when something is simply, unexpectedly good, and they haven't let themselves have something good in a long time. They talked about the Wicker Park projections for an hour. They disagreed twice about the occupancy forecast for Q2, and both of them made their cases well, and eventually Lachlan conceded the point and told her so. She had laughed once, a small, surprised laugh when he described a contractor's behavior during the River North build-out, and for a moment she looked entirely different. Younger, more like herself. Then she reached across the table for the lease summary she'd printed, extending her left arm to pull it closer, and the sleeve of her turtleneck shifted. Just slightly, just enough. The bruise that showed at her inner wrist was deep green-yellow at the edges and dark purple at the center, the coloring of something that was several days old and had been significant when it was fresh. Portia saw his eyes drop. She pulled the sleeve down in one smooth motion and said nothing. Lachlan set down his pen. "Show me your arm," he said. "It's nothing. I got it in the—" "Portia," his voice was very quiet. "Show me your arm." The silence between them stretched for a long moment. Then, slowly, Portia set the lease summary down. She pulled her left sleeve up to the elbow. The bruising started at her wrist and ran in a band up her forearm, the particular pattern of fingers that had grabbed and held and dug in. There was a second bruise higher up, older, faded nearly to yellow, the kind that lives on top of muscle rather than bone. Lachlan looked at it for a moment. When he raised his eyes to hers, his face was composed in a way that was somehow more frightening than if he'd shown anger. "Tell me how it happened." Lance gets frustrated sometimes. Her voice was flat and rehearsed. I know that sounds bad. It's complicated. He's under a lot of pressure at work, and I have a tendency to say the wrong thing at the wrong time. I provoke him. I know I do." She paused. "He's not always like this, and he's the only person who's ever. He was the first person who ever." She stopped. Her jaw worked for a moment. "People don't exactly line up for women who look like me. He knows that. He reminds me of it, and I know he's right, but I've been trying too." "Stop," Lachlan said. She stopped. He leaned forward slightly. "I want you to hear what you just said. You described a man who puts his hands on you, and then you explained that it's your fault because you're not thin enough to deserve better." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "That is not a complicated situation. That is a man who has spent 3 years convincing you of something that is not true, because it kept you from leaving." Her eyes had gone bright. She pressed her lips together. "Portia, I have watched you walk into a room full of men who had 20 years on you and dismantle their assumptions in under 10 minutes. I have watched you rebuild financial structures that 3 outside consultants said couldn't be rebuilt. You do not say the wrong thing at the wrong time. You are the sharpest person in almost every room you enter." He paused. "The only wrong thing you've been doing for 3 years is believing him." She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. The tears came despite her. "I need you to go home tonight," Lachlan said. "My driver Renzo will take you. He'll stay outside your door while you pack a bag. You'll go to the Alderton. I keep a standing suite there. You'll stay as long as you need to." "You can't just. Lachlan, if Lance finds out I said anything to you, he'll—" "He won't." There was a finality in the 2 words that didn't invite argument. "Trust me." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for whatever people look for when they're deciding whether to let themselves be helped. Then she nodded. The apartment in Lincoln Square was dark when Renzo pulled up. Lance's car was gone. Portia let herself in and stood in the entryway. For a moment, her hand still on the door handle, listening to the silence. She packed 1 bag in under 15 minutes. Efficient, practiced, the way people pack when they've spent years imagining this exact moment, but never let themselves believe it would happen. A suit for work, 2 changes of clothes, her laptop, the small envelope of documents she kept in the back of her underwear drawer that Lance didn't know about. Birth certificate, social security card, her personal bank statements from an account he'd never been added to. She had kept that account open for 2 years. She wasn't sure until tonight that she had ever planned to actually use what was in it. Renzo drove her to the Alderton without speaking. The suite was on the 22nd floor, overlooking the river, with linen sheets that smelled like cedar and a bathroom the size of her entire Lincoln Square kitchen. She showered for 20 minutes, put on the hotel robe, and sat on the edge of the bed with her phone in her lap. Lance's text came at 9:47. "I'm done trying to make this work. You have never been what I needed, and we both know it. I've met someone who actually takes care of herself. Don't reach out. Don't call my mother. The engagement is off, and the ring is in the kitchen drawer." Portia read it twice. She sat with it for a moment, turning it over the way you turn an object in your hands to understand its shape. She waited for the collapse to come. She had braced for it, the specific weight of his rejection, the crushing confirmation of everything he'd ever told her about her own worth. She had been practicing for that feeling without realizing it, building the defenses against it for years. It didn't come. What came instead was something she didn't have an immediate word for. A lightness, a loosening somewhere in her chest, as though something that had been pressing on her lungs for 3 years had simply lifted. She read the message a 3rd time and felt, astonishingly, like she could breathe. She was still sitting there when a quiet knock came at the door. Lachlan had taken off his jacket. He stood in the hallway with his sleeves rolled to his forearms, holding a paper bag from the 24-hour place on Wabash that did soup and bread at all hours, because he had noticed she'd eaten about half the gnocchi before they'd been interrupted by the lease summary, and he had done the math. "He left," Portia said, handing him the phone. He read the message. Something moved in his jaw. He handed it back without comment. "Are you all right?" She considered the question honestly, which was something she hadn't done in a long time. "I think so," she said. Yes, I think I actually am." She looked down at the phone in her hands. "I expected it to hurt more." "It will eventually," Lachlan said. "In pieces. That's how it works." He set the bag on the writing desk. "But tonight it doesn't have to." He stayed for an hour. They ate bread and soup by the window with the river lit below them, and he told her that nothing would change at work unless she wanted it to, and that his legal team would handle the lease on the Lincoln Square apartment if she needed them to, and that she was not obligated to figure out everything tonight. She didn't have to figure out anything tonight. She was simply required to sleep. When he left, she stood at the window for a long time and watched the river. 6 months is a long time when you're learning to recognize yourself again. Portia moved into a one-bedroom in Wicker Park, in her own name, with a lease she signed without asking anyone's permission. She went back to eating the way she had always eaten before Lance, which was to say abundantly and joyfully and without apology. She bought herself 3 new blazers in colors she had avoided for years, because Lance had told her bright colors called attention to her in ways she couldn't afford. She wore them anyway. She wore them specifically. She did not lose a single pound. She didn't try to. She was done trying to make herself smaller. At work, something had shifted in her bearing that even the most oblivious partners had noticed without quite being able to name. She stood differently. She held the floor in meetings with a different quality of confidence, not the careful, defended kind she'd been performing for years, but the kind that comes from having nothing left to protect. She and Lachlan fell into a new rhythm, one that existed in the margins of the professional. Coffee that ran long, late evenings that drifted from work to conversation to comfortable silence, his hand at the small of her back when he held the elevator, lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. Neither of them said anything about it. Both of them felt it. It was a gray Thursday in January when Lance Durbin showed back up in Chicago. Portia was crossing the parking structure under the Michigan Avenue building, heading from the legal firm 3 blocks over where she'd dropped off the Wicker Park acquisition documents, laptop bag over one shoulder and coffee in hand, when she heard the familiar footstep behind her. She turned around before he spoke. She had always been able to hear him coming. She had spent 3 years training herself too. He looked rough. He had lost weight in the way people lose weight when they stop eating properly and start making bad decisions in sequence, and his eyes had that specific manic brightness of a man who had convinced himself that his current crisis was someone else's fault. The woman he had left her for, she'd heard about it through mutual friends, had not lasted 4 months. "You look good," he said. He said it the way someone spits. "New clothes, new place, Lachlan Steele's little project." "Lance," her voice was even, "you need to leave." "I need $30,000. He said it with the directness of someone who had rehearsed this. "I know what's going on between you and Steele, and I know what Steele Capital actually does with those port contracts up and down the coast. I've done my research. You help me, or I go to some journalists who've been sniffing around his shipping deals for 2 years, and I give them a reason to look harder." Portia looked at him. She took her time about it. She looked at the man who had grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave green-purple marks that took 12 days to fade. The man who had stood over her plate at dinner and removed food from it. The man who had told her, with a patient, almost kindly expression, that he was doing her a favor by staying, that someone with her body and her personality wasn't exactly a compelling offer, and she should be grateful for what she had. She looked at him for a long moment and felt nothing but a quiet, clear pity. "You know what I've learned in the last 6 months, Lance?" she said. "The version of me you were talking to. The one who believed everything you said about what she was worth. She's gone. You don't actually know me at all. You knew the version of me you had access to after 3 years of making sure I didn't have access to myself." He opened his mouth. She kept going. "Go ahead and talk to your journalists. I trust Steele Capital's legal team. I also trust that whatever you think you know, you got from conjecture and desperation." She shouldered her bag. "And I'd suggest you think very carefully about what it costs to make an enemy out of someone who owns more of this city than you'll ever touch." The sound of a door opening behind her. Lance looked over her shoulder and went white. Lachlan walked in from the building entrance with 2 members of his security team, and the look on his face was the specific look of a man who has been informed of exactly what was happening before he arrived and has come with a clear purpose. He was in his coat, unhurried, hands in his pockets. He stopped beside Portia and did not look at her. He looked at Lance. "My team tells me you've been making some threats," Lachlan said pleasantly, "against my business and against a member of my staff. She's not just I know what she is to you. She is the head of strategic analysis at Steele Capital, and she is under my protection," Lachlan said. "The rest is none of your business." A black SUV pulled forward from the far end of the structure. "You're going to get in that car. You're going to be driven to your hotel, where my team will wait while you pack. You're going to leave Chicago tonight." "That isn't a request. You can't just—" "Lance." Portia stepped forward. She was shorter than him, and she stood like she wasn't. "I spent 3 years being afraid of you. I spent 3 years convinced that you were the ceiling of what I could expect, and I want you to know, not for your sake, but for mine, that I am no longer interested in you, not in your threats, not in your excuses, not in whatever story you've told yourself about who was to blame." She looked at him directly. "You had access to something you didn't know how to treat. That's your loss, not mine, not anymore." She turned and walked back toward the building entrance. She heard Lance start to say something behind her. She didn't hear what it was because the SUV doors opened and she had already stopped listening, which was the easiest and most complete thing she had done in years. In the elevator, Lachlan reached over and hit the button for the executive floor. Then he hit the stop. The elevator shuddered to a halt between the lobby and the 2nd floor. The ceiling light hummed softly. Outside the narrow windows, the city moved without them. Portia turned to look at him. "You knew he was there," she said. "You were watching. Renzo flagged his rental car in the structure 20 minutes ago." He said it simply, no apology for it. "I wasn't going to let you walk in there alone. I had it handled." "I know you did." Something in his voice had changed. The professional register had dropped away entirely, and what was left was quieter, more direct. "I've known that for a long time." She looked at him. The elevator was very small. The city light caught the planes of his face and the particular steadiness in his eyes, and she understood, with the same clarity she brought to financial models, the clarity that cut straight to what was true, that this moment had been building for 6 months without either of them saying so. "Portia." He took a breath. "I am going to say something, that it comes with no obligation and no pressure, and that if you need time or distance or anything else, I will respect that completely." He paused. "But I have been watching you rebuild yourself from the inside out for 6 months, and I have been watching your mind operate for 4 years, and I am—" He stopped, started again. "I would very much like to stop pretending that this is only professional." She was quiet for a moment. Her heart was doing something undignified that she chose not to examine too closely. "You plated my food," she said. He looked at her. "That first night, in your office, you plated my food and you told me my opinion of myself shouldn't come from someone else's mouth, and then you argued with me about occupancy forecasts for an hour and conceded the point when I was right." She held his gaze. Nobody had done any of those things before, not all in one evening. A quiet smile moved across his face, just barely. "I'm going to need you to know," Portia continued, that I'm not looking for someone to protect me. I handled that parking structure before you walked in. I know. And I'm not interested in being anyone's project. You're not a project. You're the most capable person I've ever worked with, and separately from that, you are." He stopped, made a quiet sound that might have been a laugh at his own expense. "You are remarkably difficult to be calm around for someone I've spent 4 years being professionally calm around." She felt the smile before she could do anything about it. "Then stop being professionally calm," she said. He reached up and touched her face, the edge of his thumb at her cheekbone, careful and deliberate, and kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It was the kind of kiss that had been waiting long enough to know exactly what it was. Steady and certain and warm, the way things feel when they are finally simply true. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead briefly against his jaw, and he kept his hand at her face, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Some people later would say Lachlan Steele had gone too far with Lance Durbin, that a man who drove himself out of Illinois in the middle of a January night at the suggestion of a security team deserved better than that. Portia never commented on it. She had her own thoughts about what Lance Durbin deserved, and she had said everything she intended to say to his face in a parking structure on Michigan Avenue, which she felt was more than sufficient. She had spent 3 years making herself small to fit inside someone else's idea of what she should be. She was done with that project. She was done with that size. She pressed the elevator button again, and the car resumed its climb, and she stood shoulder to shoulder with Lachlan Steele and watched the numbers rise. And for the first time in a very long time, she was looking forward to every single floor.